Let's bring in our guests now. With me here in the studio is the former Afghan ambassador to Norway, Shukria Barakzai. In Kabul, we have Afghan government spokesman Feroz Bashari. In London is Graeme Smith, the author of The Dogs Are Eating Them Now, Our War in Afghanistan. And joining us from Monterey, California is Thomas Johnson. He's the director of the Program for Culture and Conflict Studies at the Naval Postgraduate School. Good to have you all on the program. Madam Ambassador, let me start with you first. Horrible to read that the Afghan government and the US-led coalition have been responsible for more civilian deaths during the first half of this year than even the Taliban and other armed groups, which include Daesh. Does that mean that they've lost the moral authority or the moral high ground now in this war?
To be honest, the 18 years war, if we're going and judging by the half of year, which is we don't know what will make gonna happen after, let's say, 6 months or just after July, we don't know yet what will may happen till end of 2019. It's really hard to judge. But of course, the number of casualties was unfortunately always been high because every single parties, when it comes to Taliban, when it comes to some government, when it comes to non-government and non-Taliban, other terrorist groups, they're always using this human shield. The issue of civilian casualty, to be honest, is not very new in Afghanistan. It happened just right now, just right after 9/11 in 2002. I remember the massive explosion in one of the wedding in one of the districts of Afghanistan, in Helmand, where they kill innocent people. So this story is going to be continue. It never get end. But if you see the number of casualty, for instance, in 2007, 2009, 2010, was much higher, not compared to the Taliban. It was the civilian casualty when I'm talking. It's the casualty. It's the innocent Afghan people. They lost their life. But also remember, more than 45,000 young Afghan brave soldiers, they sacrificed their life too. Who will be responsible and in charge for that?
Sure.
And how we are counting this number for which side and who is responsible?
Okay, the broader question moving forward is, if after all these people have died, the Taliban's no closer to being defeated. They control half the country, but we can address some of that a little bit later on. People are losing their lives, innocent people are losing their lives. For what is the big question, right? Feroz Bashari, has the coalition and the Afghan government become more dangerous for civilians than even the Taliban?
The Afghan government has studied the recent report by UNAMA. We have serious observations on this report, especially on the mechanism of how they collected the data and the figures of civilian casualties and how they documented these figures. We believe that the Taliban are still responsible for most of the civilian casualties. We have exact figures. Our database in the Ministry of Interior shows that they're responsible for most of the civilian casualties. If I may give you an example of 3 days. Kandahar, Farah, and Kabul. Within 3 days, over 64 civilians were killed and 94 of them were wounded by the Taliban during suicide bombings and IEDs. I don't know how the UNAMA report ignored such
but the UNAMA report,
big
the UNAMA report also,
government side,
certainly, allow me to come in here for a second. What we know from the report is it's saying compared to last year, the number of civilians injured or killed by the coalition, especially when it comes to airstrikes, has more than tripled, and that there's blood on the hands of the people who are fighting the Taliban. Why would UNAMA want to lie about the Afghan government or the coalition? Isn't it better to rather admit that this is a really dirty war and that perhaps ugly things are happening and somebody needs to be held to account for the injuries and the deaths that are facing Afghan civilians?
Let me explain this. This is a bit technical issue. It's not about lying. It's about mechanism, the proper mechanism one used to collect the data about civilian casualties. We believe that the UNAMA has ignored hundreds of examples and incidents where civilians were deliberately, intentionally targeted by the Taliban. We believe that the UNAMA report, the source for the UNAMA report was mainly the media, whereas the media do not cover every single incident in which civilians were harmed and killed. So we have serious questions on the mechanism UNAMA report was written.
Okay. Okay. So Feroz, so
from the
you
Afghan
and
government side.
Okay. Okay. So you and the U.S. military both reject UNAMA's methods and findings. I don't want to get bogged down on this issue because I do want to broaden it out into the politics, peace talks in Doha, and so on. But Graeme Smith, are we failing to see the wood for the trees when it comes to this report? Are we accurately freaking out when we see a report that says that it's not the Taliban doing the most civilian killing right now in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so as you're hearing, the government rejects the findings of the UN report. The Taliban also reject the findings of the UN report. That's pretty normal. You know, the Taliban have been saying for years that they don't like the way the UN counts civilian casualties. They've been doing it the same way for more than a decade. It's become a world-leading model. So the United Nations likes the way that it counts civilian casualties so much in Afghanistan with 3 independent sources for every single incident that they've started using it around the world. And it is the gold standard for counting civilian casualties. But you're right that we have to look more broadly at the fact that this is an ugly, ugly war. It's been getting bigger every single year for the last decade, except this year. And that's the thing that I think we need to pull out from this UN report, is that civilian casualties are actually down. Hundreds of people have not died in the conflict this spring, partly because there is ongoing diplomacy now between the United States and the Taliban, with an aim of trying to bring the war to an end. So, you know, it is actually a silver lining to what could have been quite a disappointing report.
Okay, Thomas Johnson, I'm going to bring you in a second, but I just wonder, I want to get a quick word from Feroz on one part of the UNAMA report, which says that casualties overall have dropped 27% in 2019. That's what Graeme pointed out. So, do you reject the one part of the report but accept the other part of the report?
Well, it's not about rejecting the part. You were suggesting to UNAMA to go for the proper and right mechanism to help them be more transparent and credible in the report. Yes, there has been 27% decrease, which is a good news. It is because the Afghan government is a responsible government. We have the right policies and mechanisms in practice to prevent civilian casualties. His Excellency the President, in his every security meeting, is emphasizing on prevention of civilian casualties. That's a red line for the government and for the President. We are doing utmost to prevent civilian casualties. But it is the Taliban using civilians as human shields. They are fighting Afghan national security forces from within mosques, schools, and hospitals. And we have many examples, such examples, to prove that civilians, children, and women were used as human shields by the Taliban during fighting. This is against
I'm going to bring in Thomas
any
Johnson.
war standards.
Okay. Thomas Johnson, is Feroz right?
No, I don't believe he is. I think we're missing the major dynamic here. I agree with Graeme Smith that UNAMA and the United Nations in general has a very good methodology for counting civilian deaths. What we're missing is that if you only have one tool in your bucket, everything, and it's a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Now, what am I getting to there? If you take a look at the civilian deaths over the last couple of years, you'll see there's a high correlation that in the last 3 years, the United States has dropped more bombs on Afghanistan and relied more on air power. Now, there's never been a counterinsurgency in the history that has been won by air power. But since the United States ground forces have been reduced to 14,000 people, and most of those are not even doing combat missions, we are spending most of our time dropping many of these bombs from high altitudes. And both insurgency and coin theorists like to say that an Afghan is everywhere and nowhere. That's to suggest that even though the Taliban, in the report suggested today, is controlling or contesting well over 60% of the land, they don't have to hold land. They're constantly on the move. So it's very difficult. It's not like after we invaded, in October of 2001, where we caught the Taliban and Al-Qaeda on the Shamali plains, where we could drop with 50,000 men. They were out in the open. The Taliban travel in small groups and in hidden areas. And airstrikes are an extremely ineffective way of defeating an insurgency. That, on top of the notion that the Afghan Air Force is not very good. So I think that's the broader issue. There's a strong correlation between the number of bombs that we dropped and the number of air casualties, civilian casualties. Right. And like I said, over the last 3 years, we've dropped more bombs than any time of the war.
Shukria Barakzai, SIGAR came out with some fascinating statistics. And this data shows that the military and police forces' strength numbers of the Afghan forces has fallen to the lowest level that it's ever been since, well, not ever been, but since 2015. So we paint a picture here. Afghan forces very weak, and the US, as Thomas suggested, just dropping bombs from above, not engaging on the ground. Recipe for disaster, right?
Well, first of all, allow me to say that the Afghan National Security Force are not weak. Weak is not a good, let's say, word to use for a brave, committed soldiers, which is they are standing and defeating the enemy of their country.
Fewer and fewer of them with every passing year since 2015.
And let me finish.
They could be brave, undoubtedly brave.
They are facing more than 22 terrorist networks, first of all. Secondly,
which is why you need more of them, not less of them, right?
They are paying everyday life, and that war is not only an Afghan war. This is not an internal war. Afghanistan never sent any kind of or any sorts of invitation for any country to come. This is they came. This is what they want. And why right now they think coalition forces are not good, Afghan forces are weak enough because of the exit policy. I hope the investment of the 18 years at least from the, let's say, on the lead was the United Nations, United States, and other countries, which is they were committed to fight against terror. They invest on Afghan National Security Force. And the good and wonderful moral from the Afghan National Security Force was made them to be able to defeat their country. And it's not because of the salary, it's not because of they...
To defeat who?
To defeat their enemy. Despite of who is.
But which enemy is being defeated? We just heard the Taliban controls 60% of the country.
No, to be honest, what they are delivering by controlling 60% of the land. Controlling just the flag, it's a matter of flag.
Listen, Taliban are terrible in government or in controlling. That's why the Afghan people rejected them and hated them. But that's not my point. They control, as an insurgency, 60% of the country.
I believe Taliban are the reality. We cannot deny them. War is not the good weapon to go. The best is the diplomacy and peace talk, which is
why would they need that? Here's the question, right? The Afghan government negotiating team that has just been named. So you have the American track in Doha, then the Afghan government negotiating team. They can't even call themselves an Afghan government negotiating team officially because it would upset the Taliban. Because the Taliban says we don't recognize the government. So you have to have people without a title.
What do you want?
So they call the shots when it comes to negotiations. And then secondly, they're scooping up...
Who's playing bad in this game?
They're getting more and more land while the talks go on. Why would they need a resolution?
No one can give me any kind of statistics. How many schools are open where the Taliban are controlling the areas?
That's the scary thing.
How many hospitals? How many hospitals all delivering the service? But there's
Madam Ambassador, I think you're confusing me saying the Taliban's controlling 60% of the land with me saying it's better than the Afghan government controlling that land.
I'm not saying that.
They,
when it comes
they
to
don't like women in school. They don't know how to run the place. They run a terrible theocracy. It's
when
bad.
When it comes to control,
but why would you?
It means they are responsible
My
for the
point is,
60%
how do you
country.
see it as victory?
According
how do you
to
see
the
it as
report.
victory?
I will never say this is a victory.
They set the
because
conditions
whenever
of peace
Afghans
talks
are killing
and they gain
Afghan
land as
and
they
their
go
own
along.
country under different name, I will never give any kind of name or title of a victory.
I see.
Okay? And I believe those Afghan, which is they are committed to Afghanistan and to the people of Afghanistan, they will never go to choose way of violence or killing innocent Afghans, either in school or hospital, on the street or university. But is there anyone can say or can give us a figure how Taliban are delivering services to the people while it's claiming control? Control is just the sign of flag, which is carrying from one place to the other? No. We are also short. The government also have
but there's nobody giving those people the services. Therefore, there's no government control over those places.
You don't know. They are taking money from the people. From those poor families, either asking their sons, if it's young, or money. So they don't have a choice. Either they will kill them.
Feroz, Feroz Bashari, why should we have any
optimism? Let me add something.
Why should we have any optimism that anything good can come out of Doha, or anything good could come out of the Afghan delegation speaking directly with the Taliban?
Well, we believe we had good conversation with Ambassador Khalilzad here in Kabul in his stay for 9 days in Kabul. And we discussed all steps in details. So we believe we will have something good out of the Doha talks. But it's still up to the Taliban.
But
whether
what does that mean? You say you believe you had good talks.
Afghanistan or not.
What does that mean? Their talks. What does that
Ambassador
actually
Khalilzad
mean?
was here in Kabul.
Understood. But what does it mean? Tell me something that came out of it.
We have discussed. Well, the formation of the negotiation team from the Afghan side is a big news. We have just announced 15 people as part of this delegation to go and talk to the Taliban directly and represent Afghanistan in these talks. I want to add something to your previous conversation that Afghan forces are not weak. They are stronger than ever before. They can go after the enemy anywhere they want. Only in 4 months.
Do you accept
Afghan
that they are the numbers are at the lowest level since 2015?
11 prisons.
Do you accept that the numbers are at the lowest level since 2015?
Let me finish this. Afghan forces have broken 11 prisons over the past 3 or 4 months and released innocent people held captive for years by the Taliban. In 5 months, we have retaken 3 districts from the Taliban, held several years by them. Taliban now control only 22 districts out of 400.
Do you accept that the Taliban controls 60% of your landmass?
No, they only control 22 districts.
22 districts as official out of 400. Do you accept that the Taliban controls? Listen, I'm sorry, but Feroz, it sounds as if I'm speaking to a spokesman who is devoid of any objective, rational view of this. 22 out of 400 districts. Yes, fact, noted. Do you accept that the Taliban controls 60% of the country, of the landmass? Do you accept that the Taliban controls 60% of the land of Afghanistan?
It is less than 5%, and
less than
they don't have a permanent control on places.
Okay. I won't continue with this line of questioning anymore because I think, let me go to Graeme. Graeme, if we're hearing the spokesman from
Well, you have clear examples to prove all what we say.
I understand. But President Ghani, in his interview with Tanya from TRT World, accepted that the Taliban controls more than 50% of the country. But he then said, well, at least there's a silver lining that it's only 22 out of 400. But I want to go to Graeme for a second here, because Graeme, I want to ask if we are in a situation where the Afghan government is in denial about the threat posed by the Taliban on the ground.
Well, you do have a situation where both sides of the conflict underestimate each other's military strength. The Taliban don't think the government holds much territory. The government doesn't think the Taliban holds much territory. The U.S. government has stopped publishing those assessments, so we no longer get U.S. military estimates of territorial control. The last time that they published those, a few months ago, it showed that government control had been slipping and continued to slip for years. But I think what's important is that we're moving away from a situation where progress in Afghanistan can be measured according to lines on a battlefield or the number of soldiers that the Afghan government has. And now we're starting to talk about diplomacy, about ending the biggest armed conflict in the world at the bargaining table. And very exciting things are happening. I expect that probably sometime in August, we will have an announcement of some kind of initial agreement between the United States and the Taliban.
That's the hope.
Don't hold me to it, but I think that's coming.
Yeah, that's the hope from Zalmay Khalilzad.
And once we have that,
go ahead.
Once we have that, we're likely to see a movement towards formal intra-Afghan dialogue. So we have seen informal contacts between delegates from the government, delegates from civil society and the Taliban, but we're probably witnessing the birth of a formal peace process for the very first time, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, and as was mentioned, it's on two tracks at the moment because it was the Americans and the Taliban directly, and now possibly direct talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Let's see how it transpires. Thomas, I want you to have a little listen to Ashraf Ghani from that interview that was mentioned by Feroz, where President Ashraf Ghani spoke to Tanya Gutsozian from TRT World. Have a little listen to what he said about the peace talks and the upcoming election.
The peace that will impact the election, if ever, is the peace between the Afghan government and Taliban, not peace between US and Taliban. As I said, it's a series of linkage. Second, our agreement with the US and our other interlocutors is to seek a preliminary peace, a framework agreement before the election. The election is critical because election is a certain process. It's a mandated process by the Constitution, and the next leader of Afghanistan, whether it's I or someone else, must have a mandate for peace, because peace is going to require hard decisions, hard bargaining, and being able to sell it back to the Afghan people. You know, they have to buy into peace.
So Thomas, here's Ashraf Ghani saying that even if there's a peace deal in August, as was mentioned, if that happens between the US and the Taliban, that's only one part of the puzzle. There needs to be a peace between the Afghan government and the Taliban as well. And there needs to be that presidential election because you need an Afghan president to carry through with that mandate being supported by the Afghan people in ensuring that peace. What do you make of what Ghani had to say?
Well, before I comment on Ghani's statements, let me just briefly suggest and straighten out a confusion of earlier parts of the interview. Nobody has ever suggested that the Taliban control over 60% of the land. The issue is they control or contest 60% of the land, and that's a very different issue. The Taliban probably only control between 10 and 15% of the land, as has been suggested, but they contest a lot. So it's a misnomer to suggest that they control 60% of the land. That's just not true, and nobody's ever said that. Now, getting to the peace talks, I'm optimistic when any warring parties talk, but I think that there will not be any type of settlement from the Taliban side unless they are involved in a big way in an interim government. And that might not involve Ghani at all. And Ghani will never accept an interim government that he's not running. So I would like to be optimistic, but I think that the interim government with Taliban playing a major role in some type of compromise government is going to be one of the key aspects that they are going to want to negotiate with Kabul forces, Kabul government. And I don't see that happening. So, I want to see this end through negotiations, but I don't see that it's going to happen anytime soon. But with that said, President Trump desperately wants the United States out. of Afghanistan.
But
and I'm extremely fearful once the internationals leave that a civil war will break out within months.
I want to ask you, Shukria Barakzai, does it feel as if the Americans are in a rush to get out?
Very much.
And does that worry you?
Very much, because that kind of exit policy may not only affect what they invest in Afghanistan and, of course, in the region. They will pay back. This is what happened when there was a Cold War, and after late 80s, their hands they wash and they say it's done, but they came back in 2000. From my point of view, peace is not anymore a choice for us that we should go and say we will dealing with or not. Peace should be the top priority because Afghanistan and Afghans wants peace. This is, I hope everyone should understand. It's not because of President Trump, it's because what the Afghans were asking and seeking for very long, this peace. Although it was a one-way road as early as it started technically in 2004, but luckily in 2019 we are willing to have like a two-way road that there should be some ceasefire from both parties, which is that how it should work. And of course, I like the United Nations also to support justice, because peace without justice would not make sense. This is very, very important. For the President Trump policy and exit policy, to be honest, I have no clue to what to say, because this is the American politicians and lawmakers. They should think, and the think tank, that how they will let unfinished job. But when it's going to be finished, this is also a big question mark. And how they're going to deal with Daesh and IS later on, where if they think Taliban is just gone, and I believe the new version of Taliban, as Taliban was the new version of Mujahideen in their own time, 20 years back from now. So things are going to be happen. But one thing is changed a lot, and I hope everybody should understand. This is the Afghanistan and the Afghan nation. This Afghanistan is way different than Afghanistan was when the Taliban ruling Afghanistan or when the American invasion started in Afghanistan. 2019 is a different Afghanistan with different perspective among the Afghans. They've been engaged. We are not anymore a marginalized country. We are trying to have our own voice, despite of if some who would be the next president or interim government. But what is really important, to keep the frame of democracy for Afghanistan. This is what is important. Who's dealing with the peace talk? It's not important. Which kind of government and under which constitution it will frame, and what will be the rights of the people, and how they will deal with globally, internationally, with their coalition, with their with the other countries that we already been signed so many agreements, strategic agreements. So how they will deal, we will let that one. But I'm sure war is not end.
Okay, well, that's...
Peace should be on the way.
Okay, major questions ahead for Afghanistan and major challenges.
Can I add something here?
Listen, unfortunately, Feroz, your window's going to drop off the air right now because we're over time. I would love to have you back on the program, and I sincerely appreciate you coming onto the program. Feroz, Graeme, Thomas, and Shukria Barakzai, I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers.